Hello everyone. My name is Vivek. I am a software developer. I make videos about containers, Kubernetes, Go as a programming language, distributed systems, and sometimes about software engineering in general. So if you have been liking the kinds of videos that I make, you should consider subscribing to the channel and you should follow me on Twitter as well. In this particular video, we are going to continue writing the validating webhook controller that we have already started in one of the previous videos. Before actually continuing the video, let's talk about the problem statement first, why we are writing this validating webhook controller, and then we can continue with the video. So in one of the playlists, we have already written an operator, a Kubernetes operator that is going to provision a Kubernetes cluster on DigitalOcean. And this particular operator that we have written is going to listen on add events for cluster resources. So we as part of that playlist, we have also introduced a Kubernetes custom resource called cluster. And as soon as this cluster resource is created in Kubernetes API server, our operator that we have written is going to get triggered, let's say, and this operator is going to provision a Kubernetes cluster on DigitalOcean. Now, the problem is when we specify or when we create a cluster resource, we also specify version of the Kubernetes that we want to create on DigitalOcean. And because of certain reasons, let's say the version that we have specified is not actually supported by DigitalOcean. In that case, the cluster resource is going to get created successfully, and then our operator is going to get triggered, and this operator is going to, or the business logic that we have written in this operator is going to fail because the version that we have specified is not supported by DigitalOcean. So this is the problem, and to solve this problem, what we have done is we have introduced a validating webhook controller. And once we have registered the validating webhook controller with API server, before the resource is actually created or persisted in etcd, that request can be intercepted by our application, let's say. So we have registered a validating webhook controller, and that validating webhook controller calls our application, and we are calling it validation and then controller because we are validating controller kind of resources. So what happens is whenever someone tries to create a resource of type cluster, the validating webhook configuration that we have specified that calls our validation controller instead of or before actually creating the resource. So at this point in time, the resource is not actually created, but our webhook was called. And as part of this webhook, what we can do is we can check if the version that was specified in cluster resource is actually supported by DigitalOcean or not. And to do that, we can call APIs from DigitalOcean that we are going to look into. And once we have figured things out, we can respond back whether this particular resource that was submitted should be allowed or not. So in our case, if this particular version is supported by DigitalOcean, in that case, we are going to allow that request. And if the version that was specified is not supported by DigitalOcean, in that case, we are going to deny that request. And if the request is allowed, in that case, request would forward and eventually the resource would be created, and then operator would be triggered to actually provision the cluster on DigitalOcean. So this is what we were trying to implement. In the previous video, we had already set up this validation controller. We were able to create the resource that registers this validation controller. In this particular video, we are going to actually get that cluster resource that was created and do the validation. So this is the repository that we had already created in the previous video, and we were able to set up the HTTPS server, and we were successfully able to see that as soon as we created a cluster resource, this particular log was printed in the pod logs. So we were successfully able to we were successfully able to call this particular function as soon as the cluster resource was created. If you are not sure about that, I would highly recommend checking the previous video out before continuing with this one. So let's go ahead, and now this particular server was called with the cluster resource that was created. So if we see here, this cluster resource was created and validating webhook controller was called with this particular cluster resource, but that cluster resource is in uh, request instance that we have here. So first of all, what we'll have to do is we'll have to get the object that is there in the request. So let's do that, and we can do that by using ioutil dot read all, and then we can use request dot body, and this gets us slice of byte. So let's call it body colon error, and if error is not equals to nil, in that case we want to correctly log the error. So let's for now just use fmt dot printf error creating the body, and the error is going to be this error. Now that we have body, from this body we can figure out the actual type using which our webhook controller was called. So again, in one of the previous video, we have discussed in great detail that this particular or any admission controller is called with an instance of type admission review, and that admission review instance actually has the details about the cluster resource or any resource that we are interested in. So what we have to do is we have to read body to get an instance of admission review object, and to do that what we will have to do is we can use packages from API machinery. So we are going to use universal deserializer. And if you see here, if you see the let's say comment of this particular method, it says universal deserializer can convert any stored data recognized by this factory into a go object, and this is what we want to convert this particular body into a go object, and that object is admission review, because we know that whenever we register a webhook controller with API server, the webhook controller is called with this particular go object, and that satisfies runtime object. And we know that since admission review is a Kubernetes object, it must specify runtime.object, and it does. So to call this particular method initially, or first of all, we will have to create a codec factory, and codec factory, if you see here, can be created using new codec factory. So let's import this particular package here. So serializer, and we are going to, let's say, initialize, let's call it codecs colon equals to serializer and dot new codec factory. And new codec factory takes runtime.scheme, and we can very easily create a scheme using runtime package. So runtime dot new scheme is going to get us So serializer.new codec factory, and as we can see, it expects runtime.scheme. So we are going to give it scheme. And once we have codecs, again, if we, our eventual motive is to convert body into admission review. And once we have codec factory, we can use universal deserializer on that codec factory. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So we are going to call codecs dot universal deserializer, and universal deserializer doesn't accept any argument. It gets us decoder, and then we can call decode, and decode is actually going to convert that object into the specified or expected object. So decode, if you see here, decode expects data, and the data is going to be body, and apart from body, it expects group version kind, and in which particular object do we want to convert that, or do we want to get that converted object. So the group version kind, we can specify, we will have to get the group version kind for admission review object, and we will also have to create a variable of type admission review, so that we can convert the body into this particular variable. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So to figure out the GV group version kind for admission review, we are going to do a very simple Google search. So we are going to say admission review Kubernetes Go doc, and it should. So if you see here, we have admission review here, and this is the type that we are interested in. So let's import this package, and let's call it admission v1 beta 1. So gvk equals to admission v1 beta 1 dot scheme group version dot with kind. And again, if you are not very sure about this particular syntax, whenever we register a Kubernetes object with Kubernetes, we specify this variable, and this variable has a method with kind, and we with kind expects a kind, and we know that the kind is admission review. Now that we have the GVK set up, let's go ahead and try to create a variable of type admission review, and this is of type admission review, and let's pass it to GVK and admission review. All right, so what we have done is, if I try to very briefly explain it, this was the simple part. We just read the entire data slice of byte from the request, and since we already know that the request or the request body using which admission controller is called is of type admission review, we will have to convert this body into a type of admission review, and that is what we have done at this particular place. It returns an error. So let's go ahead and try to if error is not equals to nil. In that case, we want to again handle that error correctly, and for now we are just going to say error %s converting request body to admission review type, and the error is going to be this. Now that we have converted the body into the admission review type, what we can do is we can actually get the cluster resource that was created, and that resulted into this validating admission controller being called. And if we look into the admission review type, this basically has two main fields: request and response. And these fields are self-explanatory, I would say. Admission request has all the details about the request using which the validating webhook controller was called, and if we have to specify something as the result, in that case we can specify that in admission response. So right now we have this admission review, but we want to figure out the actual cluster resource using which our validating webhook controller was called. So obviously that details, as we know, should be in admission request. And if we go to admission request, we can see that it has UID, it has kind. And again, if you read all these details, you would be able to figure out what these fields are: a resource, sub-resource. But the thing that we are interested in is object. So if you see here, object is the actual field that holds the cluster resource. So if we go back to this diagram once again, so object from admission request is the field that has this cluster resource that was created on the cluster. So if we go to raw extension, in raw extension, we can see that raw is actually a slice of byte that has the underlying object. So this is the thing that we are actually interested in. So we will read the data from this particular field, and we would try to convert that data into a cluster resource. So let's go ahead and try to do that again. So initially we converted body into admission review. Now what we have to do is we have to convert admission review dot request dot object dot raw into a type of cluster. So convert or get cluster spec from admission review object. And to do that, we will have to do the exact same thing. We can use codex.universal decoder and decode obviously takes a byte slice, and that is where we can specify this particular slice of byte that actually has the underlying object that was created. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So codex dot universal decoder, it should be universal deserializer. I think we made a mistake. So it should be universal deserializer and then decode. And decode expects slice of byte as first argument. So we are going to specify admission review dot request dot object dot raw, and then we will also have to specify GVK for the request that we want to get out of this byte slice. So we will have to specify GVK for cluster resource, and we will also have to specify or create a variable of type cluster. So now we know that this cluster resource that is being created, that was written as part of another GitHub repo, another project. So that is entirely a different project. So that is the reason we don't have we don't have cluster type present locally. So we will have to do the exact same thing that we did for admission review. We imported this package, and we used the type from that package. So let's go ahead and try to do the exact same thing here as well. So we know that we have the types available here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to import this package, and we would use the type from this package. So importing that package github.com vxingzzips cluster, and the type is from cluster dot. So if we go to package APIs v1 vxing.dev v1 beta 1, there we should have cluster type here, and this is the type that we are interested in. So cluster, and we are going to call it cluster v1 alpha 1 dot cluster. And now let's also specify GVK for cluster, like we specified GVK for admission review. So what we can do is we can say GVK cluster colon equals to cluster v1 alpha 1 dot scheme. This should have scheme group person dot with kind, and kind is cluster. Okay, now that we have the GVK and the cluster instance, let's use that to and if this conversion was not successful, we would like to handle the error message. So error while getting cluster type from admission review. Now that we have successfully fetched the cluster type from the request that came to our validating webhook controller, let's just go ahead and try to just print it, just to see if things are working as expected or not. So cluster resource that we have is, and let's see if things are working or not. Yeah, And we know about this particular problem. If you want to get into more detail, you can watch the playlist where I actually created the cluster operator. But this is failing because of this dependency that we used in cluster. And to resolve that, this is what we had to do, and that is what we are going to do in this particular project as well. So go.mod, we are going to pin the dependency version for gray meta store. And once we do that, we should be able to build our project successfully. So just give me a second to resolve all these dependency problems. And as soon as we resolve them, we can see that we are able to build the project successfully. And once we have built it, we will have to deploy it. We'll have to deploy it on the Kubernetes cluster. So we are already running on, or we already have a context to a 3-node DigitalOcean cluster. So let's go ahead and try to deploy this on DigitalOcean. So to do that, we will have to create the deployment manifest, or even before that, we will have to create the secret that has the certificate and key. So again, if you do not understand this, if you do not know why did we create that, you can watch the previous video that I would add either in description or somewhere else. So create -f manifest certs and then secret.yaml. This creates the certificate that is going to be used by application to run. And then we are going to create the deployment and the service as well. So we have the validating webhook controller running successfully. Let's go ahead and try to look into the logs of that application. So this is the application, and if I create a resource of type cluster, so let's go ahead and try to do that. So I already have this repo cluster repo present locally. So that is what I'm going to use to create this. So first of all, I'm going to create the CRD. So this creates the CRD of type of clusters. And once we have the CRD, we can create the actual cluster instance. Okay, so cluster 0 was created, but we do not see anything in our validating webhook controller. And the problem is, if you remember the last video, we have just created the validating webhook controller, but we have not registered the validating webhook controller with API server. And to do that, what we can do is we can create. So now I am on our validating webhook controller repo. So create -f manifest, and we will have to actually create the validating webhook to register this validating webhook controller with API server. And that is what we have done right here. So let's go ahead and create another cluster resource. So create -f cluster1, and it says service not found. Okay, so somehow the service was not created. So we have our validating webhook controller running, and somehow the service was not created. So create -f manifest service.yaml. Now the service has been created, and as we can see here, as you can see here, okay, so this error is expected. Don't worry about it. I'm more worried about why did we not get this particular log, and I think the reason is, even though we built the project, we did not create a new image, and we will have to. So right now, if we go to deploy.yaml, this is the image that we have, and we'll have to update it with our newly made changes. So let's go ahead and try to do that. I was a bit worried of just for a second. So now that we have built the application, let's go ahead and try to build it. So docker build -t bb sing gzits. Let's tag it 1.1. And once we have successfully built the email, let's try to push it. So docker push. And once it is pushed successfully, let's update the validating webhook deployment to use the new image, and we are going to apply the deployment, validating webhook controller deployment, to make sure this deployment is running with a new image that we have built. So apply manifest and then deploy.yaml. This should be recreated. We will wait for it to be recreated. This particular pod is up and running successfully. Let's go ahead and try to look into the logs of this pod. And now if we create, first of all, let's delete all the cluster resources. Now if we create a cluster resource, we should be able to see this particular log message. So create -f manifest and then cluster 1.yaml. And if you see here, we are able to see the actual cluster resource. So if we cat cluster 1 here, we are basically interested in spec. So we should be able to see all these things in this particular log. So if you see here, we are able to see a name, we are able to see reason, token secret, node pools, etc. So whatever we have done till now seems to be working as expected. So now that we have the cluster resource, another thing that I would like to highlight is this is not how we are going to write production level validating webhook controllers. This just gives you an idea of what are all the things that are involved, how you can write your first validating webhook controller, and by referring by reading about things in great details, by looking at some other code base from, let's say, upstream, you can try to get an understanding of how do you write a production ready admission controller. But this is no way, I would say, a production ready code. So now that we have cluster, what we can do is we can have a utility. Let's call it validate cluster, and it returns whether this particular cluster resource, whether this particular request that was submitted to API server should be allowed or not. So this returns a Boolean and let's call it valid or allow. And once we have figured out if the request should be allowed to continue in the request chain or not, what we can do is we again, like we talked about, if you look into admission review, we have request and response. So we have already looked into how admission request looks like. Let's go ahead and try to quickly look into how admission response looks like. So in admission response, we have comparatively lesser fields than admission request. UID is a unique ID that can be used, or that should be the request UID, and it is used to figure out an individual request in this particular entire workflow, let's say. So request would have a unique identifier, and that request should be used in response as well. In very simple terms, we can say that to figure out which particular response, which particular request this particular response is of. So as you can see here, this says this should be copied over from the corresponding admission request, and we can do that very easily. If we talk about allowed simply, like we talked about, allowed simply means that whether this particular request should continue in the request admission chain or not, whether this particular resource should actually be created in the Kubernetes or not. Result is again, if we look into the comments, if we deny, if because of certain reasons, for example, in our case, if the version that is specified in cluster resource is not supported by DigitalOcean and we deny that particular request, in that case we can specify result, and we can specify some other details about why this particular request was denied. And we can specify, if you see here, we can specify message, we can specify reason, and all those other details. These two fields are very much related to mutating webhook controllers. So again, when we talked about in previous video, in one of the previous videos, when we talked about what are mutating and validating webhook controllers, we talked about if we set patch type and patch, this particular patch is going to be applied on the request that is being submitted to the API server. So when we write mutating webhook controller, we are going to look into those fields. But for now, we can. I hope I'm making sense when I say that a modification, a mutation on the request can be submitted by setting these two fields. And these two fields are again very similar. For example, we can specify warning, we can also specify audit annotations, and I think we have covered almost every field of this type. So let's go ahead and try to create admission response that we are going to write in this particular writer or as a response. So if allow, it simply means that allow colon error, it returns bool. So if allow or error is not equals to nil, response is going to be of type admission v1 beta1 dot admission response, and we are going to say response equals to and we are going to set all the other things here. So we are going to specify UID, and as we talked about, UID can be figured out from the request itself, and we know the request is admission review.request.uid, and since okay, so this condition must evaluate to, let me comment, if allow is false or error is not nil. So if allow is false, in that case, this statement is going to be true, which is okay, which is what we want. And then we have to also specify allowed, and this is going to be allow. In this particular case, value of allow is false, And then we will also have to specify result, and result is going to be v1.status, and here we can specify I'm just going to print it to get rid of the warning. So status has the error message. So we can specify message. We can also specify reason. So in message, we are going to specify error.error, and now it looks good to me. But if error, let's simplify it a bit. So validate cluster is just going to return bool, and if not allow, in that case we are going to return this response, otherwise the response should be okay. So UID is going to be AdmissionReview.Request.UID, and allowed is going to be true. And now that we have formed the response, what we can do is we can write the response to response writer, and we should be good. Now that we have set up the basic skeleton, let's go ahead and try to actually implement the validate cluster. And to validate cluster, let's go ahead, we will have to talk to the DigitalOcean API. So let's go ahead and try to create a directory here named package, and this package is going to have a new directory. Let's say DigitalOcean and a file named do.go. This is going to be called package DigitalOcean, and inside package DigitalOcean we will have to write a utility. That utility is going to query the DigitalOcean cluster or DigitalOcean API to figure out if the version that this cluster resource has is actually supported or not. So we are going to pass the version. So k.spec.version, string, and here we are going to have a function, let's say validate cluster version, and it is going to expect a version, and it returns bool. And let's import this package in our main package to actually call it. So we will have to export it so that it can be accessed outside of the package. So validate cluster version, and it should be good. If we go to validate cluster version, now what we have to do is we have to figure out if this particular version, again, if we try to explain it again, this version has the version that we specify when we create a cluster resource. So this is the cluster resource that we have, and this is the version that we got in here. So this version has right now, let's say in this particular instance, would have 121.5 do.0. Now, all we have to do is let's go ahead and try to look into DigitalOcean API reference. So, and from here we can figure out if a particular specified version is a valid version or supported by DigitalOcean or not. And to do that, what we can do is we can go to Kubernetes, and inside Kubernetes we would have retrieve kubeconfig, retrieve credentials, retrieve node pool, retrieve user information. Yeah, so this is the API that we are interested in. List available reasons, node sizes, and versions of Kubernetes. And the thing that we are interested in is versions of Kubernetes. We can see some examples here. We are interested in examples of Go and client.kubernetes.get. So let's just go ahead and try to just copy this thing in our code. If error is not equals to nil, in that case we are going to return error. What we are going to do is, before actually calling DigitalOcean APIs, we'll have to initialize DigitalOcean client, and that's what we are trying to do. I'm not actually talking too much about these things, because we have already done this thing, almost exact same thing, when we wrote cluster operator, because that also very heavily talks to DigitalOcean API to do things. So that is the reason I'm not talking about this. Options dot let's first try to resolve the problem, just so that we can see the definitions of those methods. That makes things a lot easier. So if you try to, for example, build it again, okay, so now actually we see the problems. So it is going to be return false, and it is a pointer type. So now that we have options, we can actually see options dot versions here, and versions is slice of Kubernetes versions. So what we are going to do is for underscore colon version equals to, sorry, comma version colon equals to options dot versions. So now we know that these are all the supported versions by DigitalOcean. And if our version is equals to this version here, in that case, it simply means that the version that we specified, that the version that we passed, is there or supported by DigitalOcean. So we are going to return true. Otherwise, we are going to return false. Okay, so this is not a map. Versions is just a slice, so we are not going to, or we will be getting that. If we equals to, so Kubernetes version, and Kubernetes version has a field called slug, and this is the slug that we specify over here. So this is version slug that we are interested in. So if this particular version is equals to slug, it simply means that this particular version is supported, otherwise not. Now the other problem that we have is, how do we figure out the DigitalOcean token? And again, if you looked into how we wrote cluster operator, if we create a particular cluster resource, we specify where the DigitalOcean token is present, and this is where that token is present. So what we can do is, we can call another utility, let's say get token, and get token is actually going to get us the token. So it returns string, and this particular, a very similar method has already been implemented by us when we wrote cluster. So I'm going to just refer that instead of writing everything again. So let's go ahead and copy this entire thing. So this is the secret that we specify in cluster, and we don't have that secret reference here. We just have version, so we should not have done that. What we have to do is, instead of passing just the version, let's pass the entire cluster. So this is going to be cluster or spec, and this is going to be of type v1 cluster v1 alpha 1 dot cluster spec dot cluster spec, and we are going to pass spec again, and this again is going to be spec and of type cluster v1 alpha 1 dot spec. And once we have spec, we can figure out the other thing. So spec dot version is going to be here, and we are also going to pass spec dot token secret. Token secret is just a string of format secret namespace slash secret name. So if you see here, secret namespace and secret name. So we are passing that to init client, and it is going to token secret string, and we are going to pass that to get token. Okay, so now that we have the secret reference, we will have to somehow create the Kubernetes client so that we can query Kubernetes API server to get the details of this particular secret, where the DigitalOcean token is stored. So let's go ahead and try to do that as well. First of all, we will have to import this. We'll have to import meta v1, and we can do that in just a second. But before that, we'll have to create the client. So let's go ahead and try to create the client again. Since we have already done these things, I'm not going to explain these things in more detail, but we are just going to create the client set that can be used to access the Kubernetes API server. So get options. Okay, so yeah, I mean, again, like I said, I'm just trying to explain how these things can be done, but obviously these things can be improved. And if you try to improve everything, the video would be too lengthy, I would say. So that is the reason I'm just trying to achieve the things right now. But these things can obviously be improved. So basically what we are trying to do is we are trying to get the kubeconfig. If we don't have the kubeconfig, we are trying to use in cluster config if this application is running from inside a pod, and then we create the client. Now, if client is equals to nil, in that case, we would want to return false. This should return bool and error. Bool is not sufficient, and we are going to maybe improve that. But things are looking good to me. Let's go ahead and try to build this and then run this. So we use this go build command to build the application. Let's build the container image, and then we will have to push that and update our deployment manifest to have updated tag. And once this particular image is pushed, we are going to update the validation controller deployment to refer to newly built image. And we see that new pod is coming up. We have to check logs of new pod. And let's go ahead and try to create a cluster resource. Message is string. So uh, let's actually enter a string that that can be evaluated, that we can see, that we can actually, that has more details about the error. So it should say the specified version is not specified. The specified version is not supported by DigitalOcean, and the version is going to be k.spec.version. And the other thing that we forgot to do is we will have to also write the things in the response, write the admission response to the response writer. And let's go ahead and try to do that. So first of all, we will have to we will have to create a byte, specifically slice of byte, so that it can be written to the response writer. So w dot write can be used to obviously write slice of byte to response writer. This is what we are going to use. And to actually write the things, we will have to first convert response to the byte. So JSON dot Marshall, and it gets a type. Basically, empty interface means it can accept any type. So response, and it returns response colon error if error is not equals to nil. In that case, again, what we would want to do is we would want to handle that error. So right now we are just using printf while converting response to byte slice. And w.write also returns how many bytes have been written, and if there was any issue writing it. So if error is not equals to nil, in that case, we again want to log it or handle the error. So error writing response to response writer. And now, before actually developing or deploying this code, let's go ahead and try to let me explain something to you. So for example, if we try to get all the clusters, we do not see any cluster resources on we don't see any cluster resource created on the cluster. If we, let's say, create one. Okay, this is breaking. But for example, now that we have our validation webhook controller, we can the validating webhook controller failed, and that is the reason the request would not be allowed to move further. And if we try to get all the cluster resources, we would not get any cluster resource here. So, but if we, for example, let's go ahead and if we try to resolve this. Okay, I did not know that is already updated. So Let's actually update it again just to figure out what exactly the problem is. And I think we are not able to figure out, if you see here, we are not able to figure out the problem. We just see nil pointer reference. The reason is we have not handled the errors correctly. We just are returning basically Boolean from places. So that is another problem. So let's go ahead and try to maybe try to resolve that. So validate cluster, and it should return, let's say result colon error colon equals to this. If error is not equals to nil, in that case we would want to return true, or the value or result, else error validating cluster resource. Uh, Now that we have changed the signature to return bool and error, we'll have to specify error as well. So errors dot new failed to create DigitalOcean client. Here we are going to return false and error, and here we are going to return true and nil, and here we are going to return errors dot new, the version is not supported. And for git token, I'm worried about this particular block of code. Get token, if error is not equals to nil, let's at least print the error. So fmt dot print f error getting token, and then it's going to be error dot error. So we are in a good state at least. Let's go ahead and try to build the application once again. build the image again with different tag, and then push that. Once this is pushed successfully, we are going to update our deployment. And a new pod should be created. We are going to check logs of that pod. And let's go ahead and try to create a cluster resource now. So create -f cluster1.yaml. Let's see what happens. Okay, so yeah, we are good. I was actually expecting this. So if you see here, it says error secrets, do secret is forbidden, user system colon service account default colon default cannot get resources secret in API group this. You should be familiar with this particular problem. It happens because this entire application, the application that we have written, is being run from inside a pod, this particular pod. And when we initialized in cluster config, we created a client, and but the service account that is being used to get the secret is not allowed to get the secret. So let's go ahead in deploy.yaml. We will have to specify a service account. Because if we don't specify a service account, default service account is automatically mounted, and that is the reason right now default service account is being used to get the secret. So let's specify a custom service account. So service account, I'm not sure if this is the format, but we'll figure out. So custom service account is going to be val con sa, and we will have to create that service account now. So let's go ahead and try to create that service account. So create service account, name is going to be this, and we just want to create the manifest. And we should be able to see sa.yaml being created, or it has been created, service account valcon.sa. Now since we have made the code change to use this service account in deploy.yaml, we will have to allow this service account to get the secrets. So what we can do is let's create a role named let's say role, and this is going to work on secret resource, and it is going to allow the verb. If you see here, we are trying to get the resource, so we are just going to allow, and we are going to generate the manifest. So role.yaml, we would be able to see role.yaml here. So role.yaml just says that this particular service account or this particular role allows get of resource secrets. Now we'll have to associate this particular role with a service account, and we can do that using role binding. So create role binding, we are going to name it vk-rb, and this associates role this with a role name is this with service account default is the namespace, and service account name is this. And again, we just want to for now create the manifest, and if you look into rb.yaml, it says that service account valcon sa from default namespace is assigned a role vk role that allows get of secret resources. So let's go ahead and try to create all these things again. So create -f manifests service account, or let's apply everything from manifests directory. So apply -f manifests, and you can see that new pod is being created. We should also be able to see roles, etc. So the role was created, the service account was also created, and if we edit the pod to see the service account, we should see the new service account. And now what we are going to do is we are going to look into the logs of our validation controller. So logs, and let's go ahead and try to create a new cluster resource. Okay, and it says that DO secret was not found because we don't have secret any secret named DO secret. So let's go ahead and try to create this DO secret. I just moved the terminal to another screen because of obvious reasons. I have to paste my DigitalOcean personal token. So now if we try to get all the secrets from default namespace, DigitalOcean secret has been created. And now we are going to create the resource again. So create -f cluster1, and it did not like it. So flag redefined kubeconfig. Let's rename it. It says flag is already defined, and we can try to explain why is that happening. But first of all, let's try to resolve this. So again, we are building the application. Once it is built, god damn it. Anyway, we will have to package the application. So docker build, and we are going to use the tag to be 015, and we are going to push it later. So and as soon as it is pushed, we are going to recreate the deployment with our latest changes. So let's look into the log of newly created pod. It failed again, but at least the problem is different. Let's try to fix this. So the problem is, if error is not equals to nil, if error is not equals to nil, in that case it should have been returned. Let me pause this. I will resolve the problem, and I will hold on. I cannot pause this, I think. Sorry about that. So if it is not returned, it simply means that error is nil. And if error is nil, okay, so this condition is the problem. Return false. Okay, so if error is not nil, in that case, error should be printed and we should return false. Otherwise, we should return true. Sorry about that. We are again going to do the same, build the application, build the container image. And then push it. So docker push. And because this particular request is failing, our validating webhook controller is breaking, obviously the cluster resources are not being created, because our validating webhook controller is not able to respond successfully. This cluster resource is only going to be created if admission controller responded with allowed equals to true. So docker push worked. We are going to use 6 here and redeploy the application. So kubectl apply -f manifests a deploy.yaml, and we should get new pod for our controller. Let's go ahead and try to create the resource again. Okay, so at least our admission controller is not breaking now, but it simply means that we are not able to successfully uh, respond to respond back from our admission controller. Okay, and this seems to be the problem. Yeah, that shouldn't have been. I don't think so. Okay, so we are able to see that the response was printed successfully. The ID is this, allowed equals to true, and rest of the things have a zero, respective zero value. So somehow we are not able to write the things back to the response writer, and that is the problem why we are getting this particular problem here. So let's do this. AdmissionReview.Response equals to the new response that we have created, and then write this. Write this back. So we are going to write admission review back to the request, or back to whoever called our validating webhook controller. So response that we are trying to return is. Okay, so now this should work. Let's see. And we are going to I'm obviously going to explain why this should work, but let's first figure out if this works or not. We are going to update the image here and create this deployment. So apply -f deploy.yaml, and we should get the new pod created, and we'll have to check the logs of that pod. Let's go ahead and try to create the cluster manifest again. And here we go. Let me explain what happened. So the reason was, initially we were trying to just respond back with admission response, but that is not how things happen. So we obviously get admission request from admission review from request. So in this particular request we have admission review. That is the reason we try to convert that into admission review, and the same object or same type of object should be written into the response. So that is the reason when we tried to just write admission response, things did not work. But when we changed that to write admission review instead of just admission response, things started working again. So now that if we try to check the cluster resources, if you see here, the cluster resource was actually created. So get cluster 0 hyphen o YAML, we should be able to see the cluster resource has been created. But the other thing that we should check is if we change the version to an unsupported version, let's say, this should not work. So vim manifest cluster 2, let's change the version to 21.3. I think it's not supported, so create -f cluster 2, and let's see here. Okay, so flag redefined, and I think the problem is we will have to we will have to define this flag only once, and this should be done inside init function of a package. This should not be, for example, get token was called once get token was called. So when we ran this, get token was called, and when we created another cluster resource, get token was called again, and then we tried to define this particular flag again. So flag dot string defines the flags, and that is the reason the flag was defined again, and we tried to define it again. That is the reason it started to break. So let's go ahead and try to fix this again by looking at the official upstream flag documentation. So golang flag. And if you see here, init is used to actually initialize the flag, because as we discussed, the problem is if we have that inside another function other than init, it is going to be that function is going to be called again, and config is going to get defined again. So to do that, or let's do that. Let's uncomment this. Let's comment this, because we know that this application is going to get called from inside the pod. So we are not going to have kubeconfig anyway. So we are going to get rid of it, but we know that this must go inside init. And we are going to comment this. And the reason is we know that we are going to run this application from inside a pod, so that won't be a problem. This should work now, but let's see. We are going to build the application and build container image, push the container image. So docker build 8 docker push. Let's check the log of newly created pod. if we create cluster 1, things should work as expected, because the version that we specify in cluster 1 is actually supported by DigitalOcean. So our validating webhook controller was called, and it was able to set allow to true, and that is the reason the cluster resource was created. But if we try to create cluster 2, let's say, in that case, let's see what happens. Here we go. So now we see that we are able to log that in our validating webhook controller. That's not a problem. But in here we can clearly see that it says admission webhook denied the request, and this is basically what we have been trying to achieve. Admission webhook denied the request. The specified version is not supported by DigitalOcean, and yeah, I think, and if we try to get all the clusters, we can see that cluster 0 is created, but cluster 1 was not actually created or persisted into etcd. And yeah, I think this is basically what I wanted to talk about in this particular video. One thing that I would like to highlight is, again, like I said, this is not production ready code. We just made it work somehow to show you how things actually happen. This obviously needs better error handling, and you will also have to specify. For example, if we get this particular error, we can use another package from API server, I think response writers. So this is what we can use to actually write that the errors back to the handlers. Or if you see here, a response writer container contains, this is a typo, so package response writers contains helpers to write responses in HTTP handlers. So if we, for example, try to use that, we can try to use that as well. So, and we can use response writers to actually write error into response. So if error is not equals to nil, in that case, response writers dot internal error, and it expects response writer. So response writer is W, request is R, and the error is fmp dot errorf, and we can specify the error, for example, unable or we can specify error. So response writer can also be used or should be used to respond back with the error that we encountered. So yeah, I think this should be sufficient. This should make sense to you. If I try to summarize things once again, before validating webhook controller, if we, for example, created this cluster resource, our operator that we had, that operator is going to do the things, and that operator is going to fail because this version is not supported by DigitalOcean. So to resolve that, we wanted to write a validating webhook controller that is going to intercept this particular request and check if the version that is specified in this particular resource is actually supported by DigitalOcean or not. And to do that, we created a validating webhook configuration manifest and a deployment that actually has the business logic for our validating webhook controller. And we were able to make sure that the resource is not created in the cluster if it doesn't have the specified or correct version specified. If we try to see one more demo, let's say, so it, I think, also specifies wrong version of cluster. So if you try to create it again, or create another resource, so cluster 3, we should be able to get the same problem. So if you see here, this particular version is not specified by or supported by DigitalOcean. Yeah, I think this is what I wanted to talk about in this video. This video was too long, I think, but yeah, I hope that it provides some value. It helps you with how to for example, debug the problems. If you liked the video, don't hesitate to share it with your friends, your colleagues, your classmates. Comment if you have any question. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.